He had always loved fixing things. From broken clocks to old engines, he found satisfaction in seeing something lifeless return to life. The village people often called him a miracle worker, though he only smiled and shook his head whenever someone praised him. He didn't care much for praise. What mattered to him was the challenge, the feeling of solving a problem that seemed impossible. One morning, he woke up to the soft glow of the sun through his small workshop window. The air smelled of damp earth and pine trees from the forest that bordered the village. While most villagers were busy with their daily chores, he decided to explore the ruins that lay a few miles outside the village. These ruins were ancient, left behind by people who had vanished centuries ago. Rumors told of machines that ran on magic and creatures that had once ruled the land. Most villagers avoided the place, afraid of stories passed down through generations. But curiosity had always been stronger than fear for him. He packed his tools carefully, making sure he had everything he might need. His heart beat faster with excitement as he walked through the overgrown path, branches brushing against his jacket. The ruins grew taller as he approached, walls covered in moss and vines. He felt a strange energy in the air, something old and powerful. He stopped for a moment, noticing strange carvings on the stone walls. They were symbols he didn't understand, but they made him pause, a chill running down his spine. Even though the place seemed abandoned, it felt alive. Inside the main hall of the ruins, he found what looked like a broken machine. Its parts were scattered, wires tangled, and nothing seemed to make sense. He knelt down, examining the components carefully. Something about it caught his eye, a small mechanism that seemed to hum faintly, as if it had a heartbeat. He ran his fingers over it, careful not to break anything. Then, almost by instinct, he began to tinker with it. As he worked, the floor beneath him shook slightly. He paused, looking around. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the sound of shifting stone echoed through the hall. His hands trembled with a mix of fear and excitement. He had felt tremors before while working on old machines, but this was different. This felt alive, powerful, and ancient. Hours passed without him noticing. The sun moved across the sky, casting long shadows on the walls. His hands moved skillfully, repairing the mechanism piece by piece. Suddenly, there was a loud click, and a hidden door at the end of the hall slowly opened. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying a smell that was both metallic and earthy. He stepped back, heart pounding. He had expected the machine to start, maybe a small light or sound, but not this. A door had opened. He approached cautiously. Beyond the door was a large chamber, and in the center, chains hung from the ceiling, holding something massive. He froze. His eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. There, chained and immobile, was a dragon. Its scales were dark, almost black, with a shimmer that reflected the little light in the room. Its eyes were closed, but even in stillness, it radiated power. The chains were thick and glowing faintly, as if they were not ordinary metal, but enchanted to hold the creature for centuries. The dragon's breathing was slow, each exhale creating a cloud of mist in the cold air. It was magnificent, terrifying, and tragic all at once. The mechanic had read stories about dragons as a child, stories filled with wonder and fear, but seeing one in real life was overwhelming. He could feel its strength even from a distance, and he wondered how anyone could have chained such a creature. His mind raced with questions. Why was it here? Who had imprisoned it? And most importantly, was it alive? He stepped closer, careful not to make sudden movements. The dragon's eyes opened slowly, revealing golden orbs that seemed to pierce through him. For a moment, neither moved. It studied him, and he studied it. He could see centuries of pain and anger in those eyes, a sadness that weighed heavily on his chest. Most people would have turned and run, but he couldn't. Something inside him told him he had to help, no matter the risk. The chains were strange. They glowed faintly, and there were mechanisms connected to the walls. He knelt down, examining them, noting the way the links intertwined with strange devices. It was clear to him that this was not ordinary imprisonment. These chains were made to hold a being of incredible power, to suppress something that could easily destroy the world if it wanted to. He took a deep breath. The logical part of his mind screamed at him to leave. Stories had warned of dragons destroying anyone who dared come near them. Yet another part of him, his curiosity, his compassion, his love for challenges, pushed him forward. He touched the chains gently, feeling the strange energy humming beneath his fingers. Then he began working, carefully manipulating the mechanisms, trying to understand how they operated. Hours passed again, and the light in the chamber dimmed as the sun set outside. The dragon had not moved, only watching him with those piercing eyes. Occasionally, it hissed softly, a warning that it was not entirely trusting. The mechanic worked steadily, sweat dripping from his brow, fingers aching from manipulating the ancient locks. He spoke softly to it, not expecting a response, but wanting it to know he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you," he whispered. "I just want to help." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last mechanism clicked. The chains loosened slightly, and a low rumble came from the dragon's throat. It shifted, testing its strength, but did not strike. The mechanic stepped back, his heart racing. He expected a roar, a burst of fire, maybe even death. But the dragon simply looked at him, silent and calculating. He realized then that this creature was far more intelligent than he had imagined. It was not mindless. It was aware, cautious, and maybe even grateful, though he couldn't be sure. The chamber was quiet except for the dragon's breathing and the faint hum of the freed mechanisms. The mechanic knew this was only the beginning. He had freed something powerful, something that could change everything. But he also knew that freeing it came with consequences he could not yet understand. The dragon's gaze followed him as he backed out of the chamber, his mind racing with questions, possibilities, and fears. He stepped out into the ruins, the air cooler now that the sun had set. He looked back once, seeing the massive form of the dragon barely visible in the dim light, and felt a strange connection. He had released it, yes, but he had also become part of its world now. Whatever came next, he realized, would not just be about fixing machines. It would be about understanding, surviving, and facing something ancient and powerful. As he made his way back to the village, his thoughts were heavy, but his heart was strangely light. He had done the impossible today. He had freed a creature no human had seen for centuries. Yet, deep inside, he knew that the dragon's freedom was only the beginning of a journey neither of them fully understood. And somehow, he felt ready to face it, whatever it might bring. The stars began to shine above the ruins, and a faint rumble echoed from the chamber, a reminder that the world had shifted in ways no one could yet predict. He kept walking, unaware that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The day after he freed the dragon, the mechanic could hardly sleep. His mind kept replaying the events from the ruins. The dragon's eyes, so full of power and sorrow, haunted him. He kept thinking about the chains, the strange glowing mechanisms, and the quiet intelligence that had stared back at him. Most people would never believe what he had seen, and he wasn't sure if he could explain it even if they did. It wasn't just the dragon itself, it was the feeling of its presence. Like the air around it had weight and history. He decided to return to the ruins at first light. He wanted to make sure the dragon was safe, and perhaps understand more about the creature he had freed. The path was quiet, the forest mist curling around the trees like a soft blanket. As he walked, he wondered what kind of life a dragon could live after being imprisoned for centuries. How would it survive? How would it even cope with freedom? When he arrived, the ruins were silent, and the dragon was not immediately visible. He called out softly, hoping not to alarm it. At first, there was no response. Then, a low rumble echoed from the shadows. The dragon stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It didn't attack. It didn't flee. It simply watched him, its golden eyes assessing. The mechanic took a cautious step closer. He spoke softly, trying to convey calm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I only want to understand you." The dragon tilted its massive head, almost as if it was listening. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a flick of its tail, it moved closer, keeping a careful distance. He spent hours near the dragon that morning, observing it, studying its behavior, and talking gently. He realized it was learning him as much as he was learning it. Every movement, every twitch of its claws or tail seemed meaningful. It was not just a beast. It was intelligent, cautious, and aware of every detail in its surroundings. The mechanic realized that this dragon had lived a long time, even if most of it had been in chains. Its mind had been shaped by centuries of imprisonment, and it had learned to survive through patience and observation. He wanted to help it further, but he also knew he had to be careful. The villagers would panic if they saw it. A dragon, even one that seemed calm, could easily destroy anything in its path. He thought about how he could approach the situation safely. Maybe he could bring food, or perhaps water from the stream nearby. He wanted to show the dragon he meant no harm, that he could be trusted. Over the next few days, he made small trips to the ruins, each time bringing supplies. The dragon grew more comfortable with his presence. At first, it kept its distance, observing him with those piercing eyes. Slowly, it allowed him to approach closer. The mechanic noticed that it would respond to his voice, to the way he moved, and even to small gestures. He began to understand that trust was possible, but it would take patience and respect. One afternoon, as he was repairing a broken mechanism near the entrance to the chamber, the dragon suddenly roared. It wasn't an angry roar. It was more of a warning. The mechanic froze, turning to see a group of men approaching from the village. They were armed, their eyes wide with fear and suspicion. Word must have spread about strange noises from the ruins. The mechanic held up his hands. "Wait, don't come closer." But the men didn't stop. The dragon growled low in its throat, wings tensing. The mechanic realized he had little time. He quickly moved in front of the dragon, trying to calm the situation. "It won't hurt you," he shouted. "I freed it, and it won't attack if we don't provoke it." The men hesitated, unsure of what to do. The dragon shifted slightly, its gaze moving between the mechanic and the intruders. It didn't move aggressively, but its presence was enough to make the men step back. Slowly, they lowered their weapons, realizing that they were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. The mechanic breathed a sigh of relief. That encounter had shown him how powerful and intimidating the dragon truly was. After the men left, the mechanic sat down, exhausted. The dragon came closer this time, lowering its massive head to the ground near him. He reached out, touching its snout gently. The dragon didn't move away. Instead, it allowed him to rest his hand there, a gesture of trust. He realized then that freeing it had been only the first step. Building a relationship with a creature that had been chained for centuries would be much more difficult thought as days passed. He continued to observe the dragon. He noticed it had habits, ways it moved, stretched, and even communicated without words. It would sometimes gaze at the sky, sometimes pace in circles, and other times remain completely still, as if deep in thought. He began to see it as more than just a beast. It was a living creature with emotions, memories, and perhaps even hopes. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mechanic sat near the stream that ran beside the ruins. The dragon came down to drink, its massive jaws breaking the surface of the water. The reflection of its scales shimmered in the fading light. He watched silently, feeling a strange connection forming between them. The dragon's eyes flicked to him, and he nodded slightly, acknowledging the bond that was growing. The mechanic knew that their bond would be tested. This dragon was not only powerful, but also unpredictable. It had lived in chains for centuries, and freedom was a new, confusing experience. He had to be patient, careful, and respectful. Every action he took could influence the dragon's reaction, and he had to learn quickly. At night, he returned to his small home in the village, but sleep did not come easily. He thought about the dragon constantly, imagining what it was thinking, feeling, and remembering. He worried about the danger it could pose to the village, but he also knew he couldn't simply leave it chained again. He had made a choice, and now he had to live with the consequences. Over the next few weeks, their interactions grew more sophisticated. The dragon began to respond to simple gestures. It would follow him when he explored the ruins, sometimes walking beside him, sometimes flying just above the trees. He learned to read its moods, understanding when it was curious, cautious, or restless. He realized that it had been isolated for so long that every small interaction was new to it. One day, while repairing an old machine in the ruins, he noticed the dragon watching him intently. It tilted its head, almost as if it was thinking. Then, unexpectedly, it nudged a piece of metal towards him with its snout. The mechanic realized that it was trying to help, participating in the work rather than just observing. A smile spread across his face. This was a turning point. The dragon wasn't just a dangerous creature anymore. It was becoming a partner, albeit a very powerful one. But with this growing bond came new worries. He knew that the outside world was not ready for a dragon. Stories and legends were filled with fear and misunderstanding. If anyone saw it too closely, panic could spread and people might try to harm it. He had to find ways to protect it, to keep it hidden while also helping it adapt to freedom. One afternoon, he noticed something unusual. The dragon seemed restless, pacing near the edge of the ruins. Its gaze was fixed on the horizon, and it let out a low, almost melodic growl. He followed its line of sight and saw movement far, in the distance another figure approaching, tall and cloaked, moving with purpose. The mechanic's heart sank. He realized that freeing the dragon had not gone unnoticed. Others were aware, and some might have dangerous intentions. He turned to the dragon, placing his hand gently on its shoulder. The dragon leaned into him slightly, acknowledging the warning. The mechanic knew that whatever was coming, they would face it together. This was no longer just about freeing a creature. It was about trust, survival, and navigating a world that neither of them fully understood. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ruins, the mechanic and the dragon stood side by side, silent but ready. The bond they were forming was fragile, yet unbreakable in its own way. They had survived the first days of freedom, and the mechanic knew the real challenges were only beginning. The dragon looked to him again, its golden eyes reflecting the fading light. It was a silent promise, an acknowledgement that they were no longer alone, and that together they could face whatever lay ahead. The mechanic nodded, understanding that trust was earned, not demanded. And for the first time, he felt truly connected to something beyond human understanding, something ancient, powerful, and free. Days passed after the initial encounter with the villagers, and the mechanic began to notice subtle changes in the dragon's behavior. The dragon was no longer just a silent observer. It had started to follow him more closely, sometimes walking beside him or flying just above the trees when he moved through the forest. Its presence was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Every step it took seemed to shake the ground slightly. Yet there was a quiet intelligence in the way it moved, a grace that contrasted with its immense size. The mechanic had begun to understand that building trust with a dragon would be a slow process. He couldn't rush it, and any mistake could provoke fear or anger. Every day he would bring supplies, water from the stream, or scraps of metal and tools, hoping to show that he was a friend rather than a threat. The dragon, in turn, started responding to his gestures, recognizing his voice, and even occasionally nudging objects toward him in what seemed like an effort to help. One morning, he decided to venture further from the ruins than ever before. He wanted to test the dragon's reactions outside the familiar territory, to see how it would behave in a more open space. The dragon followed him silently, gliding effortlessly above the treetops. The mechanic kept his eyes on the ground, moving carefully along the narrow path through the forest. He noticed the dragon's head swiveling constantly, watching every movement around them. It was as if the dragon had taken on the role of guardian, not just for the ruins, but also for him. As they moved deeper into the forest, the air grew cooler, and the sound of running water reached their ears. The mechanic led the dragon to a small clearing by a river, a place where the sunlight filtered through the leaves and created patches of warmth on the ground. The dragon landed softly, shaking the water from its scales, sending droplets sparkling through the air. For a moment, the mechanic simply watched. Fascinated by the creature's strength and beauty, the dragon began exploring the area, sniffing at rocks and examining trees, and the mechanic realized that it was curious about the world beyond its prison. He smiled, thinking about how different this experience must be for it. Freedom was not just being unchained. It was discovering a world that had moved on while it had been trapped. Every sound, smell, and movement was new, and the dragon seemed to be absorbing it all, cautiously but eagerly. While the mechanic and the dragon were enjoying the relative peace, he noticed movement in the distance. A figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden behind the trees. The figure was human, tall, and moving deliberately toward them. The mechanic's heart raced. He didn't know whether this person was a threat or someone who might understand the dragon's existence. He called out softly, trying to warn the stranger, but they didn't stop. The dragon's body tensed immediately, wings spreading slightly in a defensive posture. It growled low in its throat, a sound that vibrated through the ground and air alike. The mechanic quickly moved between the dragon and the approaching figure, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Please stop. Don't come closer," he shouted. The figure paused for a moment, clearly startled by the dragon, but then continued forward. The mechanic realized he had to act fast. He spoke calmly, trying to explain. "It won't hurt you if you don't threaten it. Please, just step back." The dragon shifted its gaze between the mechanic and the stranger, its eyes glowing faintly in the sunlight. The stranger finally stopped a few paces away, hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. The mechanic approached cautiously, maintaining a safe distance from the dragon. He could see fear in the stranger's eyes, but also curiosity. Slowly, he began to explain. "This dragon was imprisoned for centuries. I freed it. It's not dangerous if you don't provoke it." The stranger listened, eyes wide with disbelief. "A dragon?" They whispered. "Are you saying this is real?" "Yes," the mechanic replied, "and it's very real. But it's not here to hurt anyone. It's just trying to understand the world again, like I am." The dragon watched silently, its head tilting slightly, as if it understood every word. After a long pause, the stranger nodded slowly. I believe you. I've heard stories, old legends, but I never thought I'd see one." The mechanic felt a small sense of relief. He had feared hostility or panic, but this person seemed willing to understand. For the next few hours, the mechanic and the stranger observed the dragon from a safe distance. The dragon began to relax, walking and flying around the clearing, testing its wings and the environment. It didn't roar or attack. Instead, it moved with cautious curiosity. The mechanic realized that this was a breakthrough. The dragon was learning that not all humans were threats, and trust could extend beyond him. As the sun began to set, the mechanic noticed that the stranger was growing concerned. "You can't keep it here forever," they said softly. "Other people will hear about it. Some may not be as understanding as I am." The mechanic nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I know. I've thought about that. But I can't leave it chained again. It deserves freedom, and I can't abandon it." The dragon shifted slightly closer, as if sensing the conversation and acknowledging his resolve. That night, back at the ruins, the mechanic reflected on the day's events. Freeing the dragon had been just the first step, and the challenges were only beginning. He realized that their bond had grown stronger, but the outside world was unpredictable. People were curious, fearful, and sometimes dangerous. He would have to protect the dragon, teach it about the world, and navigate the complexities of trust, both with the dragon and with others. In the following days, the mechanic and the dragon explored further together. They moved through forests, across rivers, and over hills. The dragon seemed to enjoy flying, often soaring high above the treetops, then returning to the mechanic's side. Occasionally, it would demonstrate its strength, breaking logs or moving large rocks with ease, and the mechanic would watch in awe. Despite its size and power, the dragon remained careful not to harm the environment or the people in nearby villages. Through these explorations, the mechanic learned more about the dragon's intelligence. It seemed to understand patterns, remember paths, and even anticipate changes in the environment. It could sense danger, often alerting him before he noticed anything unusual. At the same time, he began to notice the dragon's emotions, moments of frustration when it couldn't fly freely in the forest, curiosity when it encountered animals, and even moments of calm when it simply rested in the sunlight. One afternoon, as they were exploring a rocky canyon, the dragon suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. Its ears twitched, and it let out a low growl. The mechanic immediately understood that something was approaching. He looked up to see dark shapes moving along the ridge, figures that seemed deliberate and hostile. His heart raced. He knew that freeing the dragon had made them visible to people who might want to capture or harm it. The dragon shifted closer to him, wings slightly unfurled, ready to defend. The mechanic took a deep breath and whispered, "Stay calm. We'll handle this together." The figures stopped at the edge of the ridge, watching, unsure of what to do. The dragon let out a warning roar, low and deep, shaking the ground and sending pebbles tumbling down the canyon walls. The figures hesitated, clearly intimidated, but they didn't leave. The mechanic realized that confrontation was inevitable. He had to find a way to protect the dragon without provoking unnecessary violence. He moved slowly, positioning himself between the dragon and the approaching threat. He tried to communicate with him calmly, explaining that the dragon was not dangerous unless threatened. The tension was palpable, every second stretching endlessly. After a long standoff, the figures finally retreated, realizing that the dragon was not something they could easily challenge. The mechanic exhaled, feeling both relief and anxiety. He looked at the dragon, which had remained composed but alert, and nodded. "We're not safe yet," he whispered, "but we're getting stronger, together." That night, as they rested in a hidden cave, the mechanic reflected on their growing bond. The dragon had become more than just a powerful creature. It was a partner, a guardian, and a companion. He realized that freedom came with responsibilities, and he would have to face dangers he had never imagined. But he also knew that trust, patience, and understanding were their greatest tools. The dragon lay near him, its golden eyes reflecting the firelight, watching and learning. The mechanic felt a deep sense of connection, a silent promise that they would face whatever challenges came their way, side by side. Their journey was no longer just about survival. It was about trust, courage, and discovering the world together in ways neither had experienced before. The forest had grown quiet, almost too quiet, as the mechanic and the dragon traveled deeper into unknown territory. The dragon moved beside him now, not just following, but walking with a sense of purpose, its massive claws leaving prints in the soft earth. The mechanic glanced at it often, marveling at the way it balanced power and grace. Though it had been freed from chains, there was a weight in its eyes, a history that pressed down like an invisible shackle. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the dragon stopped abruptly. It crouched low, ears twitching, eyes scanning the horizon. The mechanic noticed the tension in its body and knew instinctively that something was coming. But this time, it was not an immediate threat. Instead, the dragon began making low, melodic sounds almost like a song, and then suddenly it froze, staring at the distant mountains. Curiosity got the better of him. "What is it?" he whispered, stepping closer. The dragon turned its massive head toward him, golden eyes gleaming in the fading light. For a moment, the mechanic felt something shift in the dragon's gaze, a connection forming that went beyond words. Then, almost as if answering an unspoken question, the dragon began walking toward the mountains, glancing back to make sure he was following. They traveled in silence, the mechanic's mind racing with questions. He had freed this creature, but he realized now that it carried memories, secrets, and perhaps even unfinished business from a time he could barely imagine. The ruins had been just the beginning. What had happened to this dragon before it was imprisoned? Who had chained it, and why? He hoped that time and trust would reveal answers. After hours of walking, they reached a hidden valley surrounded by cliffs and ancient stone structures, partially swallowed by the earth. The dragon's movements changed immediately. It became more deliberate, almost reverent. The mechanic followed, feeling a mix of fear and awe. He could sense that this place held significance, though he could not yet understand why. The dragon approached a massive stone altar, half buried and covered in moss. It placed a claw on the surface, and the ground seemed to respond, vibrating slightly beneath their feet. The mechanic stepped closer, careful not to disturb the dragon, and noticed carvings on the altar. They were similar to the ones he had seen in the ruins, strange symbols that glowed faintly in the twilight. He realized that these markings were part of the dragon's past, a connection to a world long gone as night fell. The dragon lowered itself beside the altar, and the mechanic sat near it, keeping a respectful distance. He watched the dragon's eyes reflect the moonlight and felt a strange mixture of fear and wonder. Then, as if deciding the time was right, the dragon began to communicate in subtle ways, gestures, shifts of its massive body, even low, rumbling sounds that carried meaning he could almost understand. Through these gestures, the mechanic slowly pieced together a story. The dragon had not always been imprisoned. Long ago, it had been a guardian, a protector of a powerful civilization that had thrived in harmony with dragons and humans alike. Its duty had been to maintain balance, to protect the land and the people from threats that ordinary humans could not face. But betrayal had come from within. The civilization's leaders, fearing the dragon's power, had conspired to chain it, believing that control over such a force was more important than trust or loyalty. The mechanic listened, captivated, as the dragon's gestures revealed centuries of sorrow and anger. It had been held against its will, misunderstood, feared, and isolated from the world it once protected. He realized that freeing it was not just a physical act, it had been a moral one, a choice to restore dignity to a being that had been treated unjustly for generations. The dragon's eyes met his, and for a moment, The weight of those centuries pressed down on him. He understood the depth of what he had done. As dawn broke, the mechanic explored the valley further, discovering ruins of the civilization the dragon had once protected. Broken towers, crumbled walls, and overgrown temples told a story of grandeur and tragedy. Among the ruins, he found remnants of mechanisms similar to those that had bound the dragon, suggesting that its imprisonment had been carefully planned, perhaps even feared by those who had built the world around it. The dragon followed silently, occasionally touching the ruins with its claws, almost as if remembering. The mechanic could see flashes of emotion in its eyes, nostalgia, grief, and perhaps even a hint of longing for a time he could never know. He felt honored to witness it, yet he also understood the danger. This was a creature of immense power, shaped by centuries of captivity and the betrayal of those it had trusted most. Missteps could provoke a response that neither of them could control. In the following days, the mechanic continued to learn from the dragon. He observed its habits, its intelligence, and the way it interacted with the environment. He noticed patterns in its behavior, signs of memory and strategy, and moments of hesitation that spoke volumes about its past experiences. Each discovery brought a deeper understanding, a growing respect for a creature that was both fierce and vulnerable. One afternoon, while resting near a crumbling tower, the dragon suddenly grew restless. It leapt into the air, wings spreading wide, and let out a powerful roar that echoed through the valley. The sound carried a message of warning and dominance, a signal that the valley was its domain and that it had reclaimed a piece of its past. The mechanic watched, feeling the thrill and fear of witnessing such raw power. He understood that this was a dragon not just alive, but awake in every sense of the word. That night, as they settled near the ruins, the dragon's behavior changed once more. It became more communicative, nudging objects toward the mechanic, gesturing toward the horizon, and even allowing him to touch its scales without flinching. He realized that trust had deepened, and a silent partnership was forming. They were learning from each other, teaching patience, understanding, and mutual respect. The mechanic also began to understand the dragon's limitations. Despite its strength and intelligence, it had been isolated for centuries. It was curious, cautious, and sometimes hesitant. Freedom was overwhelming in ways he had not anticipated. Every sound, shadow, and movement could provoke fear or anger. He had to guide it carefully, showing the world without forcing it to face threats too soon. One day, while exploring a narrow canyon, they discovered carvings that seemed to depict the dragon's role as a guardian. Images of humans and dragons working together, protecting the land and defending against enemies filled the walls. The mechanic realized that this creature had been central to an entire civilization's survival, a being of importance far beyond what he had imagined. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, knowing that he was now part of this legacy, even if in a small way. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between the mechanic and the dragon strengthened. They began to anticipate each other's needs, movements, and intentions. The dragon would sometimes nudge him toward water, guide him through dangerous terrain, or alert him to potential threats. In return, the mechanic provided care, understanding, and guidance, helping it navigate a world that had changed drastically since its imprisonment. Yet, despite their growing partnership, the mechanic knew that danger was never far away. The dragon's freedom could attract those who desired its power, those who feared what they did not understand. He had to prepare for threats, learn strategies, and rely on the dragon's intelligence as much as its strength. Their journey was no longer just about exploration. It was about survival, trust, and uncovering the truth behind centuries of history. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in golden hues, the dragon perched on a cliff, gazing at the distant horizon. The mechanic approached carefully, noticing the reflective sadness in its eyes. It had been free for weeks, yet it still carried the weight of its past. He knelt beside it, placing a hand on its massive claw. The dragon leaned slightly into him, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. In that moment, the mechanic realized the true depth of their connection. This dragon was not just a creature of power, it was a being of memory, emotion, and experience. It had suffered, endured, and survived. And now, through trust and compassion, they were learning to face the world together, one careful step at a time. The valley grew quiet as night fell, stars beginning to twinkle overhead. The mechanic and the dragon sat together, companions in a world that had changed around them. He understood that their journey was far from over. The past had shaped this dragon, and the future would test them both. But for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. They had reclaimed part of history, restored freedom, and forged a bond that could withstand the challenges ahead. And as the dragon's golden eyes reflected the moonlight, the mechanic knew that he was no longer just a human guiding a creature. He was part of something far greater, a story of survival, trust, and the courage to face the unknown. Their journey had begun in chains, but now, together, they would navigate a world full of wonders and dangers, learning from each other every step of the way. The forest had grown darker as the days passed, and the mechanic could feel a change in the air. The dragon moved beside him with quiet alertness, wings slightly flexing as though it sensed something he could not. They had been exploring further than ever before, testing the boundaries of their freedom, and the mechanic knew it was only a matter of time before the outside world caught up with them. He had hoped their presence would remain unnoticed, but the world had a way of revealing itself, no matter how careful one tried to be. One afternoon, as they climbed a steep hill to reach a vantage point over the valley, the dragon stopped abruptly, lowering its head and sniffing the air. The mechanic followed its gaze and froze. In the distance, a group of figures was moving quickly toward them. They were armed, moving with purpose, and there was no mistaking their intent. These were not villagers or casual wanderers. They were hunters, scholars, and perhaps mercenaries who had heard rumors of the dragon's return. The dragon's body tensed, wings rising slightly, and its tail lashed back and forth in warning. The mechanic's heart raced, but he stayed calm, knowing that any sudden movements could provoke panic or aggression. He stepped closer to the dragon, placing a hand gently on its massive shoulder. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We can face this together." The dragon tilted its head toward him, golden eyes meeting his, and then it turned its gaze back to the approaching group as the figures drew closer. The mechanic realized the danger they posed. These people were organized, trained, and clearly prepared to capture or harm the dragon. He had to act quickly. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, hoping to communicate that neither he nor the dragon intended to attack unless provoked. "We don't want trouble," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension. "Stay back, and no one will get hurt." The group paused, clearly wary but not convinced. One of them stepped forward, voice raised. "Step aside, human. That creature belongs to those who can control it. Do not try to stop us." The mechanic's stomach tightened. He knew there was no reasoning with people who only saw the dragon as a weapon. He turned to the dragon, silently conveying the plan. They had trained each other well enough that the dragon seemed to understand his intentions. With a low growl, the dragon stepped forward slightly, wings spreading wide. The figures faltered, clearly unprepared for the display of power. The mechanic took the opportunity to speak again, his voice firm. "We are not your enemies, but if you come any closer, you will force us to defend ourselves. This dragon is not a weapon, and it is not yours to take." The tension was unbearable, the silence stretching as both sides waited for the other to make a move. Suddenly, one of the hunters fired a shot, hoping to scare the dragon. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. The dragon reacted instantly, lunging forward with incredible speed, wings beating to create gusts of wind that knocked several figures off balance. The mechanic shouted, trying to calm the situation, but it was too late. The dragon's instincts, shaped by centuries of imprisonment and survival, had taken over. It moved with precision, targeting the ground and objects near the humans without causing direct harm. Using its strength to intimidate rather than destroy, the humans retreated slightly, realizing that they were not dealing with a mindless beast. The dragon's eyes followed every movement, calculating, aware of each person's intention. The mechanic stood beside it, heart pounding, knowing that one wrong move could escalate the situation into chaos. He raised his hands again and spoke firmly. "Leave now. Go back and live to tell what you saw. There is nothing for you here." After a tense moment, the humans finally began to back away, some tripping over rocks or struggling against the wind generated by the dragon's wings. The mechanic watched carefully, ensuring they did not regroup or attack from another direction. The dragon lowered its wings slightly, but remained alert, muscles coiled as if ready to strike at any sign of danger. It was clear that even though it was free, its instincts were still sharp, honed by centuries of survival and captivity. Once the humans disappeared into the distance, the mechanic let out a long breath. He turned to the dragon, placing a hand on its massive head. "We did it. You handled that perfectly," he whispered. The dragon nudged him gently, a gesture that felt almost like approval, acknowledgement, and trust all at once. The mechanic realized that they had faced one of their first real tests together and had survived not just because of strength, but because of their bond and understanding. That night, they found a hidden cave to rest in, safe from prying eyes. The dragon lay down, curling slightly to conserve warmth, and the mechanic built a small fire nearby. He watched the flames reflect in the dragon's eyes and felt a mix of relief and concern. They had survived this confrontation, but he knew it would not be the last. The world outside the valley was vast and unpredictable, filled with people who might see the dragon as a threat, a treasure, or a weapon. Over the next several days, the mechanic focused on teaching the dragon how to navigate safely through human-populated areas. They traveled quietly, avoiding villages and main roads, using forests and valleys as cover. The dragon learned quickly, sensing potential danger before the mechanic could. It would fly high to scout the area, or move silently on the ground when humans were nearby. The mechanic marveled at its intelligence, realizing that centuries of imprisonment had not dulled its mind, but perhaps sharpened its instincts. Despite the danger, there were moments of peace. The dragon began to explore its surroundings more freely, stretching its wings in open fields and gliding through valleys with a sense of wonder. The mechanic often sat nearby, watching with admiration. He noticed small behaviors, the dragon tilting its head at unfamiliar objects, pausing to examine flowers or animals, and sometimes resting its massive head on the ground as if contemplating the world. Each moment revealed a creature that was not only powerful but also thoughtful, curious, and capable of emotions he had never seen in any animal. One afternoon, while resting near a river, the mechanic realized that the dragon's past had left scars deeper than he had imagined. Though it had grown calmer and more trusting, there were moments when sudden sounds or movements caused it to tense, wings spreading defensively and eyes narrowing. He understood that freedom was not instantaneous. Trust took time, patience, and consistency. The dragon had endured centuries of fear, betrayal, and isolation. He had freed its body, but its mind was still learning how to be freed as they moved through a dense forest one evening. The mechanic spotted smoke in the distance. He immediately recognized it as a sign of humans, perhaps a village or travelers. The dragon froze beside him, muscles coiled, eyes scanning the horizon. The mechanic knew that their presence could not be ignored for long. Humans would notice, and some would undoubtedly see the dragon as a threat. He whispered softly, "Stay calm. We can avoid them." The dragon lowered its wings slightly, but remained alert, ready to react if necessary. They detoured through a narrow canyon, using the terrain to conceal themselves. The dragon moved with incredible agility, navigating tight spaces with ease despite its size. The mechanic marveled at its skill, realizing that centuries of imprisonment had not diminished its abilities, but had perhaps made it more careful and precise. By the time the smoke disappeared from view, both were safe. But the mechanic knew that such encounters would become more frequent as word spread of the dragon's freedom. That night, as they rested on a cliff overlooking the valley, the mechanic reflected on the recent events. They had faced danger and survived, but he understood that their journey was only becoming more complex. Freedom came with responsibility, and protecting the dragon would require not just strength, but strategy, foresight, and unwavering trust. The bond between them had grown stronger through confrontation. Yet he knew the challenges ahead would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The dragon lay beside him, golden eyes reflecting the stars, and for the first time, the mechanic allowed himself a moment of hope. They had survived their first true confrontation with the outside world, and they had done it together. It was a reminder that while danger was real and constant, trust and understanding were just as powerful as any weapon. As the night deepened and the wind whispered through the trees, the mechanic realized that their journey was far from over. The outside world would continue to test them, but they had each other. The dragon was no longer just a creature of legend. It was a partner, a guardian, and a friend. And together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, learning, surviving, and growing stronger with every step. The days grew longer as the mechanic and the dragon continued their journey. They had learned to move together, reading each other's signals, anticipating danger, and exploring the world in ways neither had imagined before. The dragon had grown stronger, calmer, and more confident, though the weight of centuries spent in chains still lingered in its eyes. The mechanic understood that freedom was a process, not an event. Every moment of trust, every gesture of care, helped the dragon heal in ways he could only hope were meaningful. One morning, they reached a wide valley where the sunlight poured over the grass in golden waves. The dragon spread its wings, taking flight with effortless grace, circling above before landing gently beside the mechanic. The air was calm, and for a moment, the world seemed still. It was in these quiet moments that the mechanic realized how much they had changed each other. He had freed the dragon's body, but the dragon had freed a part of him as well. A part he had not known was trapped by fear, routine, and doubt. As they explored the valley, the dragon became curious about the land, sniffing the air, touching the ground with massive claws, and testing its wings against the open sky. The mechanic followed carefully, guiding it through hidden paths and showing it how to move without drawing unwanted attention. He realized that the dragon's strength was not just physical, but also mental. It observed, learned, and adapted with intelligence that rivaled any human's. He often found himself marveling at the creature, humbled by the depth of its awareness and resilience. Their peace, however, was soon disrupted. In the distance, smoke rose against the horizon. The mechanic froze, recognizing the familiar signs of humans, travelers, villagers, or perhaps hunters. The dragon immediately tensed, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. The mechanic knew that their journey had reached a critical point. They could not avoid the outside world forever. Freedom meant facing danger, and the dragon's presence would always draw attention, whether welcomed or feared. The mechanic and the dragon moved swiftly, using the terrain to their advantage. They followed a narrow river, winding through the forest, allowing the dragon to scout from above while keeping a low profile on the ground. The dragon's instincts were sharp, sensing every movement and sound with incredible precision. Together, they moved like a single unit, mechanic and dragon, human and beast, each guiding and protecting the other. Eventually, they reached a hidden canyon where they could rest safely. The mechanic sat on a large rock, watching the dragon explore the area. It stretched its wings, testing the wind, and let out a low melodic growl that echoed softly through the canyon. He realized that the dragon's freedom was more than movement. It was expression. After centuries of chains, it was learning to be itself again, and he felt privileged to witness it. That night, as stars filled the sky, the mechanic reflected on everything that had happened. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear, yet they had survived and grown stronger together. The dragon had trusted him with its life, and he had promised to protect it. He understood now that trust was a two-way street, and the bond they had formed was more powerful than any chains or threats could ever be. In the following days, they ventured further, discovering hidden valleys, rivers, and forests untouched by humans. The dragon became more playful, occasionally nudging the mechanic with its snout or gently tossing objects with its claws. It tested its abilities, flying higher and farther, and exploring its environment with curiosity and confidence. The mechanic observed quietly, learning as much from the dragon as it learned from him. He understood that their partnership was no longer just about survival. It was about mutual respect, exploration, and shared experience. One afternoon, while resting on a cliff overlooking the valley, the dragon suddenly became alert. Its golden eyes scanned the horizon, and the mechanic felt a familiar tension in the air. A group of people had spotted them, travelers, who had not yet realized the dragon's true nature, but were drawn by its presence. The mechanic acted quickly, positioning himself between the dragon and the approaching humans. He raised his hands and spoke firmly. "We mean no harm. Stay back, and no one will get hurt." The humans hesitated, unsure of what they were seeing. The dragon stepped forward slightly, wings flexing, and let out a warning roar that shook the ground. The humans backed away, some falling to their knees in fear. The mechanic spoke again, calmly but with authority. "This dragon is not a weapon. It has lived in chains for centuries and only wishes to live freely. Leave us in peace." After a tense standoff, the humans retreated, clearly understanding that this was not a creature to challenge. The mechanic exhaled slowly, placing a hand on the dragon's massive head. "We did it," he whispered. The dragon nudged him gently, as if acknowledging their shared victory. They had faced one of the world's first real threats to their freedom, and had survived, not through aggression, but through understanding, trust, and control. The mechanic realized that their journey had reached a turning point. The dragon's freedom was no longer just about avoiding chains or threats. It was about navigating the world responsibly, learning to interact with humans safely, and teaching them that power did not have to be destructive. He began thinking about the future, how they could explore the world, help others, and perhaps even find a place where dragons and humans could coexist peacefully. Over the next weeks, they traveled through mountains and forests, always careful but increasingly confident. The dragon's intelligence and instincts allowed them to move safely through areas where humans lived, and the mechanic continued teaching it subtle ways to communicate, warn and protect without causing fear unnecessarily. He noticed the dragon's emotions growing more complex: playfulness, curiosity, and even moments of calm contemplation. It was no longer merely a survivor. It was becoming a being that understood its place in the world. One day, they reached a valley filled with wildflowers and open plains. The dragon landed gently, sniffing the air and walking slowly through the grass. The mechanic followed, observing the way the sunlight caught its scales, shimmering in gold and green. For a long time, neither spoke. They simply existed together, sharing the quiet peace of the land. The mechanic realized that this was the life they had both been seeking: freedom, safety, and companionship. As they explored the valley, the mechanic discovered ancient ruins similar to those where he had first found the dragon. This place seemed untouched by humans for centuries. The dragon approached a stone altar, touching it with its claws, and the mechanic saw recognition in its eyes. He understood that the dragon was reconnecting with its past, a history that had been lost to time but was now slowly being remembered. Night fell, and the dragon lay beside the mechanic, wings partially folded, breathing softly in the cool air. The mechanic reflected on their journey, from the first moment he discovered the dragon chained in the ruins, to the challenges of trust, danger, and understanding, to the freedom they now shared. He felt a profound sense of accomplishment and humility. They had both changed. He had freed the dragon, but the dragon had also freed him from fear, doubt, and isolation. In the days that followed, they continued to explore, discovering hidden valleys, streams, and forests. The dragon became more adventurous, flying farther, testing the limits of its strength, and learning to trust the world again. The mechanic guided it, teaching caution, observation, and patience. Together, they faced small dangers: wild animals, unstable terrain, and unexpected weather, always emerging stronger and more connected. Eventually, they returned to the ruins where the dragon had first been chained. The mechanic walked slowly through the halls, touching the broken mechanisms and tracing the ancient symbols. The dragon followed silently, almost reverently. For a moment, the mechanic felt the weight of centuries pressing down on him: the cruelty, the imprisonment, and the fear that had once consumed the dragon. But he also felt hope, understanding, and the deep bond that had formed between them. As the sun set over the ruins, casting long shadows and bathing the stone in gold, the mechanic looked at the dragon and smiled. "We've come a long way," he whispered. The dragon nudged him gently, its golden eyes reflecting the light. They had survived the impossible, reclaimed freedom, and forged a bond that could never be broken. The mechanic knew that challenges would continue to come, that the world was unpredictable and sometimes cruel. But he also knew that they could face anything together. The dragon was no longer a prisoner of the past. It was a being of strength, intelligence, and freedom. And he, too, had grown, learning patience, courage, and the power of trust. As night fell and stars filled the sky, the mechanic and the dragon sat side by side, companions in a world that was vast, mysterious, and full of possibility. They had faced danger, discovered history, and built a connection that transcended fear and misunderstanding. And in that quiet moment, they both understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains, it was the presence of trust, companionship, and the courage to face the unknown together. They would continue their journey, exploring, learning, and protecting each other. The dragon had been freed, and the mechanic had found a companion unlike any other. Together, they would navigate the world, uncover its secrets, and face whatever challenges came their way. Their story was far off,